Okay, y'all. Happy National Poetry Month. One of my favorite months. April is not the cruelest month. It's also a pretty awesome month for many. Those of us that love poetry, those of us that are curious about poetry, those of us who find poetry a challenge or a provocation. I have all of us and all of you in mind in pitching this pretty unusual topic. I've given versions of this talk before, but it seems especially appropriate in this moment and at this time, not merely because of National Poetry Month. And I'll have more to say anon about that. Again, the title is I Hear America Singing, Poetry, Patriotism, and These United States. In that Dropbox, you have something like a micro anthology of some of my favorite patriotic poetry and poems that I think teach especially well. I'll be talking through some poems today, but I'll be referencing poems that you then have available, and I hope you will be able to bring almost immediately into your classroom. But let me just tell you a little bit about the provocation behind this. Some of you may have signed up saying, I don't know about teaching patriotism or poetry or patriotic poetry in my classes. And I want to make the case for why you might consider doing so. And at the center of this is that there is just a remarkable and I think highly teachable archive of American poetry available to you. And although there is some high risk, high reward sense to bringing the topic of patriotism into a classroom in 2023, I'm going to offer some techniques, I think, and especially some possibilities for how to broach this in your classroom in thoroughgoing and productive ways. So let me just lay out for you the sort of structure here. My talk has three parts, and then I hope we'll have a fairly robust back and forth in the Q&A. Any questions I can take, I'm delighted to take them then. But three parts. The first, I'm going to offer some definitions around patriotic poetry and around patriotism, nationalism even. Then we're going to talk about some forms of patriotic poetry. And finally, move to some occasions, moments where we tend to encounter patriotic poetry in our day-to-day lives. Okay, some definitions. Let me begin there. Begin tragically with a pop quiz. I'm going to ask you all a very straightforward question. I will not make you use any sort of device to lodge your answers, just something mean to do at the end of a long day of teaching. You've been giving pop quizzes all day, and here you are being given one. Turnaround is fair play, as they say. Okay, so the question is, what is most American poetry about? It's a rhetorical question because the answer is most American poetry is about America and or poetry. And sometimes, as we'll see today, even American poetry. That is to say that when we talk about this big, broad expanse called not just America, but American poetry, there's a real red thread that if we pull on, we see a constant returning to themes of, not to be surprised here, constitutionalism, freedom, the idea of diversity and representation, all of this kind of baked into the very basis of American poetry. There are good reasons for this that we'll discuss, but it's not too much to say that a great deal, if not most American poetry, kind of returns to the topic of America. As we'll see, sometimes in celebratory ways, sometimes in mythical ways, sometimes in critical ways, always, though, keeping a mind on or an eye on what it is that poetry can express about a sense of place, a sense of connection, community, and especially a sense of patriotism. So let's have that in mind, how often American poetry ends up being kind of self-reflexive. That is, thinking about itself, thinking in some ways even about its own production. This goes way back in time and helps us think about something called American literary nationalism, which sounds pretty highfalutin, but is actually super straightforward. When we talk about American literary nationalism, we're largely going back to a moment in the 19th century, sort of beginning after the founding of these United States and going until the end of the 19th century, a pretty concerted literary movement that was aimed at developing, this is the key phrase, a distinct and distinctive American literature. A distinct and distinctive American literature. Now, along the way, not all of the work produced in this American literary nationalism was all that accomplished, really all that good. And some of it seems pretty embarrassing to 21st century readers. My favorite example of this is a poem that you probably do not know, and that is probably better for you. A poem that is super indulgent, that was in its moment pretty popular. It's called the Columbiad. It is a 10-book national epic that Joel Barlow, a fascinating historical figure, Joel Barlow started to write in the 1790s and finally published as this massive epic poem in 1807. He had big ambitions, Joel Barlow did. He wanted to sort of go to Homer and Virgil and especially to Milton and try to take an epic form and have it be about the newly United States of America. It is really intended to be, he wants this desperately to be a national epic. And I think literary historians, critics look back on it as a sort of noble failure whose poetry maybe does not sing for us today. I will not read much of this, you're welcome. But I think you get a sense from the sort of early part of the poem, the invocation here, where he directly addresses almighty freedom. Give my venturous song the force, the charm that to thy voice belong. 'Tis thine to shape my course, to light my way, to nerve my country with the patriot lay, to teach all men where all their interest lies, how rulers may be just and nations wise. Strong in thy strength, I bend no suppliant knee, invoke no miracle, no muse, but thee. Now, that probably does not send you running to Amazon to buy a copy of the Columbiad. But I think you can start to see here at least the effort, taking a sort of largely European literary tradition, the epic, and trying to relocate it. It's not going to invoke sort of classical muses, but instead freedom itself, almighty freedom, Barlow says here. So this starts at the very founding. Again, 1790s is when Barlow starts writing this as a poem initially called Visions of Columbus and then revised into the Columbiad in the earliest part of the 19th century. But this helps to set the tone for what follows. Much of what follows comes through not just a literary nationalism, but a self-reliant American literary nationalism that owes a great deal, especially to Ralph Waldo Emerson, writing in the mid-19th century. Emerson will famously make a series of claims throughout his career, but especially in an essay that teaches wonderfully well called The American Scholar from 1837. I'll give you just three of the greatest hits from this essay that, again, teach well, even out of context, as standalone quotations. Emerson says, our day of dependence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands draws to a close. The millions that around us are rushing into life cannot always be fed on the seary remains of foreign harvests. Events, actions arise that must be sung and that will sing themselves. Again, a sort of direct response to the influence of Europe, the reliance, as it were, on those literary and cultural traditions. And he's saying that is over. We now need to put aside those foreign harvests and look to something here, something local, something uniquely American as the sort of, again, harvest for the literature and culture that will come next. Later in the essay, he says, genius is always sufficiently the enemy of genius by over-influence. The literature of every nation bears me witness. The English dramatic poets have Shakespeareized now for over 200 years. Again, picking on the great English playwright and poet as somebody who has overly influenced a literary tradition, and he worries is overly influencing American literary nationalism too. And probably the greatest hit, a really evocative and wonderful phrase, again, making a real case for this American literary nationalism, for this Emersonian self-reliant American literary nationalism. Emerson says, we've listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe. So what does Emerson want us to listen to instead? What does he want us to feed on? What harvest would he prefer? In an essay from just 7 years later called The Poet, he says in a, I think, very powerful way, I look in vain for the poet whom I describe. We do not with sufficient plainness or sufficient profoundness address ourselves to life, nor dare we chant our own times and social circumstance. If we filled the day with bravery, we should not shrink from celebrating it. And then a wonderful Emersonian catalog here, he says, our log rowing, our stumps and their politics, our fisheries, our Negroes and Indians, our boasts, our repudiations, the wrath of rogues, the pusillanimity of honest men, the northern trade, the southern planting, the western clearing, Oregon and Texas are yet unsung. Yet America is a poem in our eyes. Its ample geography dazzles the imagination, and it will not wait long for meters. So here Emerson is saying, let's put aside all of that European influence. Let's have our own distinct and distinctive literature, and let's make it about America, make it uniquely American. If we think there's something exceptional about the country, let's celebrate, he says, though that is exceptional. So that's 1844. Just 11 years later, Emerson's looking for the great poet, capital T, capital P, who can really capture this Americanness, really help to propel American literary nationalism in this still quite young country. And somebody called Walt Whitman comes along and says, ooh, I'll be that poet. I'd be delighted to be that poet. Again, writing in the preface to the 1855 Leaves of Grass, Walt Whitman will say, the United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem. And Whitman's entire poetic project will, in important ways, respond to these calls for a distinct and distinctive American literature. We have lots of examples of this. Whitman, in a late interview, back and forth he has with somebody called J.T. Trowbridge, he has a way of acknowledging his debt to Emerson. This is quoted again, speech that he gave to Trowbridge, who later recollected it after Whitman's death. Whitman freely admitted that he could never have written his poems if he had not first come to himself, and that Emerson helped him to find himself. I asked him if he thought he would have come to himself without Emerson's help. He said, yes, but it would have taken longer. And he used this characteristic expression. I was simmering, simmering, simmering. Emerson brought me to a boil. I think we can clearly see that in the call and response between Emerson and Whitman. We can also clearly see it almost immediately in the poetry that Whitman produces in the wake of that strong, inspiring influence from Emerson. My favorite example of this, and one that gives this talk its title, is called I Hear America Singing. Whitman would revise this poem. You've got this in your handout, but this is really at the center of a certain tradition of patriotic poetry. So I'll read this to you and then we'll come back to it later in the talk. I hear America singing the varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat. The deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench. The hatter singing as he stands. The woodcutter's song, the plowboy's on his way in the morning, or at noon, intermission, or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother, or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing. Each day singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. The day what belongs to the day, at night the party of young fellows, robust, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs. Again, if the charge here is to come up with a distinct and distinctive American literature, a distinct and distinctive American poetry, we can see Whitman trying extraordinarily hard to capture some of the distinctiveness of American life circa 1867, and especially to capture the diversity of the people he hears singing. He hears America singing, but listen to how polyvocal, how many voices make up the sounds he hears. A lot going on here. We can talk about this in the Q&A, but I'll just note again, it's the varied carols. And he's going to use a very Whitmanian form here, that of anaphora, the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive lines, what we call a sort of Whitmanian catalog. Here it is in a sort of miniature version, straightforwardly offered to us: the carpenter, the mason, the boatman, the shoemaker, all of those articles helping to emphasize, again, diversity. Each of these singers is singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. You can almost hear the out of many oneness of this poem that, again, is deeply patriotic and also really connected to that Emersonian, self-reliant American literary nationalism that was so central to the 19th century and what follows. Okay, that brings us to a definition of patriotism. I just want you to have this in place. It's going to be important for the rest of the talk. Very straightforward from the Oxford English Dictionary, with Whitman sort of still echoing in your ears. Let's just have a very simple definition of patriotism: the quality of being patriotic, love of or devotion to one's country. I kind of like the adjectival definition for these purposes a little better, especially the second definition from the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary: having the character of a patriot, worthy or characteristic of a patriot, marked by devotion to, and this is key, the well-being or interests of one's country. Now, again, both these definitions really get us to think about patriotism potentially as a pretty flat, celebratory, love it or leave it sort of logic. But I don't think that's what's going on, especially when we think about well-being or interests of one's country. I have a wonderful colleague and old friend, Ben Railton, who's written a terrific book that I highly recommend called Of Thee I Sing: The Contested History of American Patriotism. And what Railton argues here is that we want to think about patriotism not as a monolithic thing, as one thing with one definition, but as offered to us in at least 4 different ways, 4 different versions of American patriotism. Often we think first of that celebratory, a sort of communal expression of an idealized America. Sometimes, Joel Barlow, we'll see especially, a sort of mythic patriotism. And that's the creation of national myths that are often, by their definition, a little exclusionary. They exclude certain communities, certain people. But he adds to that celebratory and mythic sense a really important sense of active patriotism. Those are acts of service and sacrifice, not just directly or indirectly, but directly for the nation. We might think especially of military service in this way as being part of that, but not restricted to military service. Lots of ways one can serve one's country, can serve the nation. And finally, and I think this is essential for understanding and teaching these texts, another and maybe most important version of American patriotism is critical patriotism. Often comes back to arguments for how a nation has fallen short of its ideals, articulated or unarticulated ideals, that are sort of seeking to move the nation, especially the American nation, toward a more perfect union. For Railton, for me, and for all of the poets we're going to talk about today, it is not one version of American patriotism. It is often a little of all 4 wrapped together. And I think that's the real teaching opportunity here, is to give a poem that is absolutely patriotic, but that combines or weaves together the celebratory, the mythic, the active, and the critical, all in one single poem. This is going to get us again to think about not a love it or leave it logic, but in the name of a great poet who we'll talk about a little later, Richard Blanco, that the process of being patriotic, of loving a country, is a process. It is not just a single state of being. So his wonderful collection called How to Love a Country is exactly that, not quite a self-help guide, but a series of poems that really come back to the combination of those different forms, those different versions of American patriotism. Okay, with the time I have left, I want to talk about some forms of patriotic poetry, and then move to talk about some occasions of patriotic poetry. With forms, I'm going to begin with a little bit of a cheat, which is just to acknowledge that historically the relations between music and poetry have been very close, but especially in a patriotic context. We can think of a number of examples of this, but it goes back obviously to Homer, thinking about here in an 18th century painting showing Homer with a musical instrument, which is perhaps indeed how his poems would have been performed. So it's a long literary tradition that goes way, way back and comes up to things like Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, even though he is largely a songwriter. Let's have those relationships in mind, especially because you're going to see me really struggle in the coming minutes not to sing aloud to you. And believe me, it is best for all of us if I do not sing aloud to you. Why is that? Well, because often patriotic poems are set to music, and that's how they enjoy their greatest circulation. We can think of the Star-Spangled Banner, obviously. We can also think of something like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, a very famous Civil War poem, beginning of which I will try not to sing. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. I can see from your faces, you know this song. You know the melody and the rhythm to which this poem is often set. That happened almost immediately in the Civil War, where a popular song, often called John Brown's Body, was sort of retrofitted with the lyrics to this song. Because it was in a fixed verse form, because there was a regular meter, that was easy to do. But then it took on a life all its own. This happens again and again in patriotic poetry, where you almost are always, if you're reading a poem aloud, suppressing the music, the song, the melody, the air that goes underneath it. Again, I'm going to read this to you without singing. It's going to be hard, but I'm going to do it. The first stanza of America the Beautiful. O beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. I think I deserve some applause for not actually singing that. Really hard not to say America in the middle of that, but I was strong. That speaks again to this really sympathetic relationship between poetry and music. It also speaks in some ways to how the form of this poem is really doing a lot of work. The repetitions, the rhythms, the meter really help this to be a memorable poem, especially again when it's set to a melody. But this begins its life as a poem. As we look at these lyrics, maybe hearing them for the first time outside of the context of a song, we're almost immediately to celebratory and mythic representations of American patriotism. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain. Again, this incredible celebration of, in many ways, the physical beauty of the landscape. God shedding his grace on thee. Even the celebration of brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Feels celebratory, feels mythic in a big way. But when we go to the second stanza, what would be the second verse in the song, notice the change here. O beautiful for pilgrim feet, whose stern impassioned stress, a thoroughfare for freedom beat across the wilderness. America, America, God mend thine every flaw, confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. Again, stanza one, here we're in stanza two. The very next set of verse almost immediately moves us from that celebratory or mythic with a representation of stern pilgrims. An injunction not to shed grace on thee, but to mend thy every flaw, acknowledging there might be flaws in America, and asking to confirm that soul in self-control and to, in some ways, balance out liberty with law. I think we're very quickly moving into an active and especially a critical American patriotism here. Again, the sense that America is not perfect. One has to learn how to love the country. We're acknowledging those faults and trying to encourage it toward meeting the wonderful ideals articulated in our founding documents. What I want to suggest is that this dynamic of articulating both the positive, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and especially to inter-articulate celebratory, mythic, active, And critical patriotisms happens again and again in this poetry, and it's why it teaches like a dream. Many examples that I could give you. Another great one that you know well. You all know This Land Is Your Land. Again, I'm not going to sing it. And the wonderful celebration of diversity, of inclusion, of expanse. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island. From the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. As I was walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway. I saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. Those are the lyrics you all know, and they are deeply celebratory and often mythic here. In fact, it feels very much like Bates's poem, like America the Beautiful, and like Whitman in some ways. But people always forget the next couple of stanzas. Moving from the celebratory and the mythic here to something more active and maybe more critical. As I went walking, I saw a sign there, and on that sign, it said no trespassing. But on the other side, it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. In the shadow of the steeple, I saw my people. By the relief office, I seen my people. As they stood there hungry, I stood there asking, is this land made for you and me? Again, it's easy to focus on those first two stanzas, the first two verses. But when we get to the third and the fourth, we see, Guthrie is absolutely trying to canvas not just the diversity and the expanse of this country, but also different forms of patriotism along the way. Again, this dynamic plays out in almost all patriotic poetry, and in a very rewarding way. Active, critical patriotism interarticulated with celebratory and mythic. Which brings me to Bruce Springsteen's Butt. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about Bruce Springsteen's Butt, but there it is, emblazoned from 1984 before you. Okay, surely you know that song, and surely you've actually probably heard people comment on the tension at the center of this song. From that repetitive anthemic refrain, I was born in the USA, and Max Weinberg's really amazing emphatic drumming, this seems like a straightforwardly celebratory and mythic even song. It is often something we sing in public occasions with our fists in the air, celebrating America. And yet, as Springsteen himself has commented, if you listen to not to the chorus, but to the verses, there's something else going on beyond the celebratory and the mythic. Born down in a dead man's town, the first kick I took was when I hit the ground. You end up like a dog that's been beat too much till you spend half your life just covering up. Then I was born in the USA. I was born in the USA, born in the USA. Got into a little hometown jam, so they put a rifle in my hand, sent me off to a foreign land to go and kill the yellow man. Again, the sense here of A, active patriotism, and B, a critical patriotism interarticulated with that anthemic claim of pride, potentially, maybe resignation. Who knows what the speaker's standpoint here is when he says, I was born in the USA. As the song goes on, we get a pretty bleak picture about working at the refinery, about not being able to find work after coming home from war. Went down to see the VA man. He said, son, don't you understand? Thinking about the return home of veterans, somebody who's still there and he's all gone. That sense of loss, of ongoing trauma, of being, as Springsteen says, in the shadow of the penitentiary. 10 years burning down the road, nowhere to run, ain't got nowhere to go. Born in the USA. Again, I want to suggest that these songs, these poems, are very much interarticulating all four forms or versions of American patriotism, and doing so in a very compelling and really, I think, accessible way for our students to be able to see that it's not just one version, it's several different versions, again, articulated together. Okay, so that really helps us think about music and poetry together. Again, all of those and many other examples teach, I think, wonderfully well. There are also other forms of American poetry that have a long tradition. Because these are easy and straightforward, I've given you in your handout a bunch of sonnets, so 14-line poems that I think teach very well, that are very connected to similar forms of patriotism. can start with Emma Lazarus's famous poem, The New Colossus, which gives us some very famous lines. This was a poem that she wrote to raise money for the foundation on which the Statue of Liberty would eventually rest. It has lines like, keep ancient lands your storied pomp, give me your tired, your poor, huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. It's a wonderful poem that teaches well, not least because, as you can see from the quotation marks, this is spoken in the voice, a persona of the Statue of Liberty itself or herself. And there's a lot of nuance in how Lazarus is framing this through the sonnet form. Again, a patriotic poem that, if we just take those lines out of context, actually gives us just the celebratory or in some ways the mythic. And yet, if we read the whole poem in context, we get all four versions of patriotism. Claude McKay's wonderful poem from 1921, America, is another great example that starts with the critical, but also seems to go back to the celebratory at various moments in its 14 lines. Although she feeds me bread of bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, stealing my breath of life, I will confess I love this cultured hell that tests my youth. Those 3 or 2.5 lines setting up as a dependent clause what follows, I will confess I love this cultured hell that tests my youth. We begin with the critical, but note that we come back, if not to the celebratory, some sense here in the poem of maybe begrudging patriotism. This poem too teaches wonderfully well. As this E. Cummings' slightly more elusive poem next to, of course, God, America, I, which involves a sort of pastiche, a pulling together of all these different patriotic phrases, probably somebody giving a speech drunk. The sonnet concludes, he spoke and drank rapidly a glass of water. My students really respond well to some of the empty rhetoric next to, of course, God, America, I love you, land of the pilgrims, and so forth. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early my country 'tis of centuries. Cummings' playful wordplay here, clearly getting us to hear some of the emptiness in that rhetoric. Again, a patriotic poem that teaches very well. The wonderful Terence Hayes has recently, in the last decade or so, published an entire book of American sonnets, what he calls American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin. All of these teach wonderfully well. Another form beyond sort of a fixed verse form like the sonnet that often brings us to patriotic poetry involves thinking about the celebratory, the mythic, the active, and the critical together through conversations that take place over time and space. One of my favorite conversations, which I want to have a lot of time to spend on, is a series of responses to Whitman's very famous I Hear America Singing in 1867. I suspect many of you already are aware of, or sometimes even teach the conversation around these, but just two other wonderful poems here with responding to Whitman. One comes from Langston Hughes, very famous poem, I too sing America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am America. So much to say about this wonderful poem, especially the shift from I sing America to I am America from the first line to the last. But you can really see the ways in which Hughes is acknowledging the influence and example of Whitman, but also making room for a different set of voices that maybe Whitman underestimated or was unable to hear. Again, from I Hear America Singing to I Too Sing America. Walt Whitman and everyone else should hear my voice in that din as well. Another poet, much more recently, Lee Alvarez, whose work I really admire, has written a sort of response to both Whitman and Hughes called I Too Sing America. I Too Sing America. I know it's been said before, but not in this voice. Fantano and the mango, marimbo, y bongo. not in this sanjoku of English con español. I see, it's my turn to say what I see. I'm going to sing America. The rest of the poem, which you have in your packet, is rich with a sort of shifts, linguistic and cultural, between her native languages, her native cultures, and the cultures and languages of Whitman and Hughes. These three poems teach wonderfully well, especially when not read by such a gringo speaker. Let's have in mind then, this is another form. It's not a fixed verse form. It's not a sonnet. It's not a song, but that you can think of one of the forms of patriotic poem being conversations like this, that again, take place over space and time, where Whitman and Hughes and Alvarez are having an ongoing conversation, as some of your students might too, responding to each of these three poets about what they hear, what they sing about America. Some mixture, again, of the celebratory, the mythic, the active, and the critical. Okay, y'all. I'm going to end with a brief discussion of some occasions in which we encounter patriotic poetry as a way to, again, bring this from the classroom or the anthology into our day-to-day lives, which is so much, for me at least, the way I think about poetry as a lived experience, as something that really brightens and informs our day-to-day lives. One of those occasions, interestingly, is in the performance of patriotic song. So a wonderful theorist called Benedict Anderson, who wrote a great book about nationalism. The book's called Imagine Communities. And he has this sort of wonderful riff on what it's like for people to sing national anthems together. He says, take national anthems, for example, sung on national holidays. No matter how banal the words and mediocre the tunes, there is in this singing a moment of simultaneity. At precisely such moments, people wholly unknown to each other utter the same verses to the same melody. The image, unisonance. He goes on to talk about it as the echoed physical realization of the imagined community, the echoed physical realization of the nation. He says how selfless this unisonance feels. If we're aware that others are singing these songs precisely when and where we are, we have no idea who they may be, or even where, out of earshot, they are singing. Nothing connects us all but imagined sound. Again, if we're thinking about those different versions of patriotic poetry, of patriotism, it's not to suggest that it's one definition, but all four definitions, all four versions interarticulated. It means that a moment, like a baseball game, everybody singing or not singing, as may be the case, in a famous performance of a national anthem, one that still brings goosebumps in recollecting, even and especially in moments where the occasion of a national anthem leads to protest. This too is connected with how Anderson is thinking about those moments where something abstract like nationalism becomes physically embodied. When we all sing along or don't sing along, when we all stand or don't stand. Again, the various responses perhaps best representing the very diversity that so many of these songs, so many of these poems celebrate, mythologize, act as a form of service, and finally are critical of even. There's one other occasion that I think is really important for patriotic poetry, and I'm just going to make a big pitch for how teachable this final occasion is, and that is at inaugurations. Over the last several decades, there's been a new tradition, relatively new tradition, of a poet standing up in the inauguration ceremony and reading a poem, often a poem written expressly for that occasion, for that day. Here are the examples. 1961, Robert Frost. 1993, Maya Angelou. 1997, Miller Williams. 2009, Elizabeth Alexander. 2013, Richard Blanco, who I talked about earlier. And 2021, Amanda Gorman. Now, you might notice here, Kennedy, Clinton, Clinton, Obama, Obama, Biden. They say that the truth has a liberal bias. I don't know about that, but it certainly seems like poetry has a liberal bias. I think that's a real missed opportunity. I do think that whenever the next Republican is elected, it would be really nice to have an inaugural poet. I'd like this to be a more bipartisan event because it's a wonderful moment, no matter what your politics are, to have poetry become part of a national conversation. Sometimes it's gone very well, sometimes it's gone fairly poorly. What you see here in this image is Robert Frost, who was unable to read aloud the poem he had just written for John F. Kennedy's inauguration. And so he had to, because of the wind and because of the glare, just sort of recite another poem that he had, the gift outright, a poem he had memorized. And so we didn't get his performance of the poem he actually wrote for John F. Kennedy. That's Lyndon Johnson trying, I guess, to help him either write a poem or hold down the paper. But there have been great successes like Maya Angelou and Elizabeth Alexander, who managed to produce really good poems that I think still endure. Here is Miller Williams on the left and Richard Blanco on the right. Again, very fine poets and very good poems, some of which I've included in your packet. But the truly brilliant, the best of these, I think, so far has been Amanda Gorman's, which has taken on a life of its own. It's certainly catapulted this young woman to great fame and acclaim. And I think it really is a poem that students respond well to and that teaches wonderfully well. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. I think you can clearly see, not just in Gorman's poem, but in all of the inaugural poems and inaugural poems to come, the interarticulation of all of those versions of patriotism and a real provocation for us as teachers, as citizens, to try to bring this wonderful, diverse, and highly teachable archive of American poetry, yes, into our classrooms, but also, I want to suggest, into our lives. With that, my friends, I'm going to just I show you a couple of resources that Elizabeth's going to make available now in the Dropbox for you. All my slides you're welcome to raid and steal. Same with the handout. Please do take those poems and give them a second or even third life. Just some suggestions for further reading. Again, I talked about Ben Railton's wonderful book. It's short and sweet and very helpful. I've included here some kind of basic background books that I tend to like when I'm teaching poetry that have been very helpful for my own thinking and pedagogy. Fussel's and Wolesky's are really terrific how-to guides on poetry. David Orr's is a little more irreverent, but quite wonderful. Both Edward Hirsch's How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry and his sort of series of close readings, The Heart of American Poetry, are really rich resources. I've also included my favorite anthologies of American poetry. One is a 5-volume Library of America set. I've got some of those here. You can usually get good education discounts to buy those. And the other is a recently released and fabulous anthology by Kevin Young called African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and So on. I've also given you on here some links, just helpful things that when I'm teaching poetry, especially patriotic poetry, I think are helpful, especially the guide at the bottom of how to teach Gorman's The Hill We Climb. I think that can really be helpful in, again, immediately bringing it into your classroom. I've also got a bunch of ideas here for how to assign exercises, little activities that can help bring patriotic poetry into your classrooms. There's just an immense amount of this poetry out there. If you can actually have your students crowdsource some of this, have them go to the Poetry Foundation, type in America and look at the hundreds of responses. That is poems called America, but also poems that they have sort of flagged as being about America, about the United States. I still love recitation, memorization activities. I still have my college students do it. I really think it's a fabulous way, especially maybe with a patriotic sonnet, 14 lines. have them memorize it, have them recite it either to the group or individually to you. It can be a really nice way for them, again, to have the poem live within them. And as an old colleague and friend used to say, once you've memorized a poem, you'll never be lonely. You'll never be alone, which I love. Poetry out loud is obviously very popular and ubiquitous now in a lot of schools. This can actually be an assignment that might lead to your students getting involved in that wonderful activity, which, if these images are any indication, is a whole lot of fun. Again, because we talked about the relations between poetry and music, I really think setting American poetry, setting patriotic poetry to music is dead easy. It can also be a nice way to maybe take an old song and set it, an old poem and set it to new music. Famous examples of this. I don't actually think that Dickinson's poetry does that well with The Eyes of Texas, but it does do really well with The Yellow Rose of Texas. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. I'm going to stop there. But as you can see, the form of a lot of these patriotic poems can easily be connected to song because there's a fairly regular form, hymn form, or meter that can easily be adapted. Certainly into hip hop, that's often an easy connection to make. The old assignments are rewriting in American poetry. I love this. I do this a lot in my classes. In fact, among other things, I have students respond to and take contemporary modern poems and rewrite those, including Langston Hughes's I Too sing. And in one case, one of my former students, one of my colleague and my former student, actually published his poem online, and it produced, again, for our class, rewriting an American patriotic poem, and it got some play as the student became something of a big deal on social media and certainly on the football field. Social annotation is a big thing. I think it can be really nice to have your students work together in groups or online even and try to annotate a shared text, a shared patriotic poem. Genius and Hypothesis give us models for that, but there's also old school ways, just giving them a poem and having them work in small groups to go through and annotate. Finally, there's just wonderful visual art out there that I really encourage folks to, especially for our visual learners, maybe to pair a patriotic poem with a piece of art. Obviously, someone like Whitman, there's a ton of illustrations out there. This is one of my favorites. A wonderful illustrator called Alan Crawford has a whole book of Leaves of Grass illustrations. But you could also do something like Norman Rockwell's famous painting, The Right to Know from 1968. This would pair wonderfully well, I think, with any of the Whitman, Hughes, Alvarez triumvirate. And finally, because it's such a large and vibrant archive of poems, it'd be really easy to see how people have responded over time to these poems, what sorts of cultural representations we've been able to find. And I've got an assignment up here that I think helps to get students to think about responses over